Hi, folks. Hope you're all doing well today. I'm having a wonderful afternoon here on February 8th, 2018. And like so many of you, paying attention to many of the things that are going on in the world. One of those things um, that I think is probably at the top of everyone's priority of late is what they're calling the opioid crisis. And I wanted to make a few comments on this. Uh, again, having been on the planet for quite some time and having been a professional counselor for 27 years and having started off my career as a chemical dependency counselor, uh, I guess what pops into my mind is that the human relationship or experience of addiction has been around, since the beginning of time. I often ask people a question such as, how many things can we become addicted to as human beings? Of course, we can become addicted to anything. Um, and so an addiction to a drug, to an opioid, has been around for a long, long time. Um, I suppose it's always been a problem. It's always been something that humanity has wrestled with. I think that's really fair to say. Um, Specific to opioids, we know that poppies and things like this have been grown for thousands of years. I think a little bit of research, will show that and show quite a long history of addiction and the impact of opioid use, in different cultures, and of course, in the Western world. Um, Throughout my career, as a counselor and as an addictions counselor, um, I've seen, I guess you could say, kind of uh, um, drug abuse crises, overdose crises, come and go in different forms. You know, Back in the 60s, cocaine, what have you. Opioids were pretty popular back then as well. You know, moving into meth and ice and all sorts of different things, that have just been a crisis, an epidemic at different points. And of course, every time there's a crisis like this, if you want to call it that, an epidemic, it's kind of like the collective mind, goes a little bit frantic, becomes panicky, and all of a sudden there's a number of different councils and committees and associations that come together to try to address it. Um, and it feels like historically as well that there's been movement to not only address it but to eradicate addiction. And of course, when we look into that, we can, people say there are many different facets to it. It's a very complex issue. Um, I can agree with that, absolutely. Which kind of speaks to the point that I want to make today is that I'm not so sure that addiction or the human tendency to want um, to indulge to the degree that it becomes destructive, I'm not so sure that that can be eradicated. Now, I've spoken on this topic for a number of years, a couple of decades now, around the human deeply embedded psychological structure of narcissism, um, of grandiosity, and of egocentricity. What sometimes mythologically or archetypally we might call the immature golden child. In other words, what's that mean? What that means is that embedded deeply into our psyche, there is a very self-fixated focus of who we are. That's what it means to be infantile. Uh, the infantile and immature part of our psyche is always interested in moving towards pleasure and moving away from pain, and also very invested in instant gratification. So knowing that those are the basic components, the deeply embedded components of our psychological makeup and structures, um, it's it's pretty easy to see that we are by our very nature prone to addiction. Um, I mean, that is the nature of addiction, isn't it? There's an instant payoff, and of course, that payoff doesn't last very long. We build tolerance, we take on more, and there's another hit of instant gratification, and it's a very, of course, dangerous, to put it politely, immature facet of the psyche that if it continues, it will lead to adverse consequences and death. All indulgences do that. All addictions will do that. That's the underlying mechanics of addiction. Now, I want to draw another piece into this because, you know, in counseling, much of counseling, at least that I do, and from a trauma-informed perspective, and this has to be connected with addiction as well, because a lot of folks are talking now about how early childhood traumatic experiences are directly linked, have a very high positive correlation to the possibility of addictive kinds of thoughts and behaviors. We've known that for a long time. That's nothing new. Again, another committee has come together to tell us that that there's something about the traumatic experience that we have as human beings that makes us a little bit more susceptible to addictive thoughts, behaviors, etc. And so when we talk about trauma, so that's another facet that we can tie into this. Another discussion around trauma is attachment. And there's a lot of buzz, if you will, a lot of research coming out right now, especially in the wake of the, if you will, digital technology addiction that people are wrestling with now. There's a lot of research and talk that is focusing the idea around attachment. That people are getting more attached, more addicted to technology, but that is not satisfying, and it's actually counterproductive. It actually creates the illusion of connectedness, but it isn't, resulting in further loneliness and isolation and anxiety and depression. That's very clear now. People have been seeing this for decades already, but another committee had to come together and decide that this was actually going on. But the piece, I guess, that gets highlighted in this is that brain research, what have you, is showing that the human being is wired for connection. And not electronic connection, but actually person-to-person connection, which kind of takes us into this idea of attachment theory. Now, I'm going to be brief here, and it's just an opinion, it's just an observation that I'm making. But we know developmentally in attachment theory, if you will, in human development, that we start out our life very, very dependent, radically dependent, and so we need other people in our lives in order to survive. Attachment is not a warm, fuzzy label. It's pretty mechanical. It means I better hang on to another human being, else I'm going to die. Now, if that all goes well, and the baby's world, if you will, the child's world is nurturing and warm and accepting, and needs are being met by other human beings. That starts to feel good. It's a very sensual experience, and oxytocin starts to flow, and we get a bonding experience out of that. I suppose developmentally that is healthy attachment. But we know that to grow up, to mature as a human being, is to not necessarily kind of let go of those attachments, but to find the truth of who we are, if you will, not in other people, but in something bigger, in something greater, in something ideological, in something mythological. And that ultimately our attachments are there. It's not at the disposal of others, but there's a reorientation in the psyche that occurs. So in other words, if somebody were to, like a child, continue to uh, find a sense of themselves and their worth and their lovability and their identity, if they were to continue to do that into adolescence and into adulthood, we would say that that's pathological. We would say that that's an addiction, that that's codependency, that it's unhealthy, that woven into our psyche, woven into the development of who we are as to be mature adults, is to actually begin to attach to something bigger than ourselves. So, one could say that addiction is really unhealthy attachment. Addiction is kind of if you will, a more graphic, toxic word that says unhealthy attachment, is it not? We can have these toxic attachments. And yet, the very structure of the psyche is set up for attachment. So, to try to get rid of addiction, if you will, I'm not sure that that's possible. Because I think embedded in that, or just underneath that, there's a healthy attachment that we're all looking for, that we say that, that we're trying to guide people towards. But somewhere in that mix of what we call life, that gets confused, if you will. Now, let's say for a moment that somebody's unhealthy attachment to drugs or alcohol is really a symptom of a disrupted human attachment when they were younger. Now, that doesn't mean game over, does it? Not everybody who has disrupted attachment when they're young or through their life ends up attaching in an unhealthy way to a substance or a process or a thought. Not everybody does that. Some people rise above it. But even in the word rise above, you see, to rise above something is a vertical statement. It means that the person who had the experience of trauma or disrupted attachment has somehow attached to something bigger that elevates them. And I think that phenomena there lends itself better to explanation through transpersonal psychology than traditional psychology. Because in those circumstances, when there's no human being to attach to, the great thing about who we are as human beings is that we have the ability to transcend that, to elevate that, to overcome that, to rise above that by connecting psychologically or spiritually to something bigger and form attachment there. It's interesting, in my parent leadership group, and of course parents come to this because the relationship with their children and family members has been disrupted, and there's most of the time trauma in the history that shows disrupted attachment. Lots of reasons to explain why there's conflict and tension and lack of connectedness. And people come in asking, well, how do I repair the attachment? Well, geez, people say it can be done, and I think it can be, but it can take an awfully long time, and you really have to be a pro at it. There's not a lot of room for mistakes. I said, but here's the deal. Let's say, for instance, that attachment got disrupted when the child was, an infant, or a young child. Now you've got a teenager who you're having conflict and tension with because you don't have a secure bond with. So what you've got is a teenager who on the inside is feeling the needs of an infant. So what you've got is these attachment needs of an infant, but you've got the Also, concurrently, the psychological development of somebody who's moving into adolescence, into puberty, which signals a breakaway from the family. So yes, that is when we as people tend to want to break away, where individuation starts to become very powerful, when the need to be part of another group, a peer group or what have you, outside of the family becomes incredibly powerful. We start to look for something bigger to attach to than our family. So what I tell parents is that, you know what, the game isn't over. You may not be able to repair that that emotional bond. Maybe you can. We'll work on that. But where you can bond is in your convictions. You can have shared convictions, shared values. Those can bond you together. And I even say to the parents in my group, what has brought you all here tonight, and why do you all keep coming week after week? We're not related. We're not related by blood. We're not related by experience. None of us have grown up with each other, but yet we're bonded. Some of you come here because this group has become like family to you, because it's, what you're able to get in this group, you can't get anywhere else. And it's become like family. Some of you are closer to each other in this group than you are to your own family members or to other people in the world. How has that happened if we're not related by blood, if we have not spent time together? I'm telling you, because what you've come here to experience is a certain set of convictions. And you can bond there. So as I've said before in previous videos, in terms of trauma, and trauma often resulting from another human being not showing up for us in the way that we had hoped that they would, that when people don't show up for us in the way that we think they should, in a way that sometimes psychology says that they should, there's almost this tragic line of thinking that goes with it. It would almost be like somebody pulls the rug out from under you. That you fall flat on your face, because when you're small, you need to lean up against somebody else. And if that person isn't there for whatever reason, you just fall on your face and you're crushed. What if that weren't the case? What if what really happens is that when a human being isn't there to attach to, we actually fall into something else, something bigger? And what if really that is the initiatory, offering of trauma? I've often said trauma is like this. What is the similarities, the family of origin similarities between Batman, Spider-Man, and Superman? They all experience early childhood trauma, death of parents. And what happens there in the psyche, and that line of mythology shows it really well. Comic book heroes and those kinds of things, and anything mythological will show this, is that the psyche splits, but there can often be kind of a rise up of one of those pieces. In other words, you either become a superhero or a supervillain. When the person gets traumatized, they can feel incredibly robbed and bitter, and consequently want the world to pay for the pain that they have experienced. And so their mission is to destroy life. Another person whose family is taken away, they realize the preciousness of life, and they become a champion for life. Same trauma both have experienced. One can become a taker of life in the form of consumption of a drug. Another person can become the therapist sitting right across the table from them, can become the outreach worker, can become the, the work at the food bank. You see that all the time. People, the transformation of the supervillain into the superhero. People who have fought addiction, who have fought anger management issues, who have fought anxiety and depression, and they've overcome it. And oftentimes, the response to that overcoming, or what's birthed out of that overcoming, is to be a champion now, is to be a champion for those very things. But it came through the trauma. So what we call trauma can actually be an initiation. But it all depends on how you see it. If we see it as an initiation, then trauma is just something that happens in the journey of life. There's no way to escape it. I don't really think there is. There isn't a person that I've encountered that has not experienced some deep disappointment, some deep traumatic experience. Maybe they think they had a great life as a kid, but eventually, somebody in their life is going to die. Somebody's going to get sick. Something will happen. I don't believe any of us go unscathed. And is that a tragedy, or is that an opportunity to be transformed, to build character, to become more of who we really are? I think people will speak to that. People who have been sick, people who have experienced death. And yes, there are people who have those experiences of a family member or themselves, and they end up becoming supervillains. Families experience deaths and births and things of this nature, and sometimes the family just tears itself apart. Sometimes people come closer together. That's the thing we really should be focusing on. Not the elimination of the trauma or the tragedy, but what we make of it. And how does that happen? I spoke earlier on, and I'll leave it here for today, but I spoke earlier, and I think I've got posted here on LinkedIn about some thoughts on what I call psychological soil. And in that, I share some observations. And having watched families and people deal with adverse experiences, adversarial situations, what we might call disruptions or traumatic experiences. So again, this is just something I've been wanting to say for a long time, as I see society struggle one more time with another crisis. And all these bright minds come to the tables to try to figure out a cure. This happens all the time. As I said, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. I've seen lots of crises, lots of epidemics, lots of the brightest minds in the entire world coming together to try to come up with solutions. And isn't it a little odd that here we are in another epidemic? If already all the best minds in the world have come together to forward all the best ideas, and evidence-based practices, why are we experiencing this again? Not only are we experiencing it again, according to statistics, we're experiencing it at a greater level than ever before. It's like Einstein said, it's not an issue of means. It's it's not about the means. It's about the aim. We're aiming at the wrong thing here, folks. Maybe it's about time we aimed ourselves at the right target instead of being like a dog chasing its tail. So I look forward to seeing your videos out there and your thoughts and articles on this topic. I think we really need some people who have been in the field for a long time to speak to this, because we need an elevated conversation. We need a different conversation around this. So again, thanks for listening. Looking forward to your thoughts. Have a good day. Bye.